Now, I've had a couple of questions with regards to diaphragmatic breathing or breathing through the diaphragm. I think first off we need to understand the primary functions of the diaphragm and its position within the body. Now, the main functions of the diaphragm is respiration and stabilisation. Now, it originates in the inner portions of the lower 6 ribs, the xiphoid process, and it comes down and inserts into lumbar vertebra, the upper lumbar vertebra 1, 2 and 3 via the central tendon. Now, when you take in air, the diaphragm contracts, flattens and descends. That allows the thoracic cavity to lengthen essentially, which is going to allow the lungs to be able to expand and take in air. At the same time, when the diaphragm descends, your guts descend and your pelvic floor descends. When you exhale, the diaphragm then ascends, allowing the guts to move back up and also allowing the pelvic floor to move back up. Now, the diaphragm separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Now, as mentioned, it's not only involved in respiration, but when the diaphragm contracts and essentially descends, because it's attached into the lumbar vertebra, it then becomes a stabilizer. So then it loses its role as a respiratory muscle. When we understand the role of the diaphragm and its position within the body, how do we perform a diaphragmatic breath and how do we get 360 degrees of air? Now, in order for the lungs to be able to expand, the diaphragm has to descend, and also the rib cage has to be able to move and expand. So ribs 1 to 7 are known as the pump handle ribs, and ribs 8 to 12 are known as the bucket handle ribs. So ribs 1 to 7, when we are taking in air, they are externally rotating slightly, and at the same time they are moving forward and back. The chest is expanding so you can optimize your breathing and your inhalation. The lower 4 ribs, 8 to 12, are moving, and I'm exaggerating this, out and in, out and in. So in order for us to optimize our breathing and get 360 degrees of air, we first have to make sure that the rib cage is stacked directly over the hips. We also need to make sure that we have an equal length-tension relationship between all of the muscles that surround the abdominal cavity. Now, let's say you have tightness through the low back region, potentially through the thoracic region here. The opposing muscles at the front might be a little bit more lengthened. Now, when you go to take in air, air is going to potentially travel to the path of least resistance. So what may happen is when you breathe in, because these muscles are tight, air is going to travel forward and potentially provide a stomach distension. Now, we also don't want the chest to flare either. So imagine we've got again tightness here and here. The rib cage is essentially in this position. So when we breathe in, it causes this flaring of the rib cage. What we actually want, as I've already mentioned, is the ribs to be stacked directly over the hips, which is going to allow 360 degrees of air. Now, in order for us to get that, we first need to make sure that the diaphragm can descend. Now, in order for the diaphragm to be able to descend, it has to be in a position where it can ascend first. Now, to do that, what you can try just now is if we can first posteriorly tilt our pelvis. Okay, so we're not moving from the low back. Think about where the sacrum and the coccyx is. There's just going to be a slight posterior tilt from here. Then you can put your hands on your side muscles. Sorry, I'm on a step here. Side muscles or your obliques, right? Then what I'd like to do is imagine you're fogging a glass. So we're going to exhale until we feel your side muscles contract. Once you've let all the air out, you're going to put the tongue on the roof of your mouth, close your mouth, and then take in a nose breath. And watch my chest and back. So do we notice how there's air coming forward and air coming into the back? So that's essentially creating that 360 degrees of air. But again, if I have the ribs stacked over the hips correctly, what we ideally want is a slight posterior tilt at the pelvis, or a counter-nuated